She is porcelain in a gilded cage, and he is the one determined to test her strength. Theirs is a game of silence and glances, where hatred borders on obsession, and a single touch could shatter everything. The rain against the high, enchanted windows of Malfoy Manor did not patter. It drummed, a rhythmic, relentless siege that had lasted for 3 days. Inside, the silence was heavier than the storm. It was a curated silence, smelling of beeswax, old magic, and the icy metallic tang of silver polish. Hermione Granger stood before the full-length mirror in her chambers, her breath shallow, barely misting the glass. She smoothed the skirt of her dark emerald robes, her fingers trembling just once before she willed them into stillness. Narcissa had chosen the fabric. "Green suits you, my dear," she had said, her voice soft as velvet, masking the steel beneath. "It reminds them that you belong to this house, even if the blood tells a different story." Belonging. It was a dangerous word in this household. Tonight, the heir was returning. Draco had been away for 2 years. First, Durmstrang to finish his education, away from the scrutiny of the British ministry. Then a tour of the continent that Lucius deemed necessary for his political maturity. Hermione remembered him as a whirlwind of sharp elbows and sharper words, a boy who looked at her as if she were a stain on his mother's favourite rug. But they had been children then. Now they were 20. She adjusted the high collar of her dress. It felt less like clothing and more like armour. "Miss Hermione!" The house elf's squeak made her turn. Tilly stood by the door, wringing her long fingers. "Mistress Narcissa asks for you in the drawing room. Master Draco. He has arrived." Hermione's heart gave a traitorous, violent thud against her ribs. She nodded, her face arranging itself into the mask she had perfected over a decade of living in the viper's nest. Chin high, eyes calm, hands folded demurely. The perfect doll, the porcelain ward. "I am coming, Tilly." The walk to the drawing room was a journey through a museum of intimidation. Portraits of ancestors sneered down at her from the shadows, their painted eyes tracking the intruder in their midst. Hermione ignored them. She knew the floor plan of the manor better than she knew the lines of her own palms. She knew which floorboards creaked and which shadows offered sanctuary. She paused at the heavy oak doors, taking one last steadying breath. "Control," she told herself. "You are stone. You are ice." She pushed the doors open. The room was bathed in the warm, flickering glow of the fireplace, but the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees the moment she crossed the threshold. Lucius stood by the mantel, a glass of fire whiskey in hand, his expression unreadable. Narcissa was seated on the chaise, her posture rigid, though her eyes were wet. And there, standing in the centre of the Persian rug, was Draco. He was taller. That was the first thing that struck her, a physical blow to her senses. The boy's lanky frame had filled out into the broad shoulders of a man, encased in a travelling cloak of heavy black wool that was damp with rain. His hair, once gelled back severely, now fell in a loose, chaotic wave over his forehead, paler than the moonlight. He was listening to his father, his jaw set, but at the sound of the door closing, he turned. Grey eyes locked onto hers. Time seemed to warp, stretching thin and taut like a wire about to snap. There was no sneer on his face now, no childish grimace of disgust. His expression was terrifyingly blank, a stillness that mirrored her own. He looked at her not as a person, but as a puzzle he had left unsolved and had now returned to finish. He swept his gaze down her body, lingering on the emerald silk, then back up to her eyes. It felt like a physical touch, invasive and cold. "Granger," he said. His voice had dropped an octave, rough with disuse, or perhaps just the fatigue of travel. It vibrated in the air between them. "Draco," she replied, her voice steady, though her knees felt like water. She offered a slight, formal curtsy, the one Narcissa had drilled into her until her muscles ached. "Welcome home." "Home," he repeated, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. He turned back to his mother, dismissing Hermione as effectively as if she were a piece of furniture. "She's still here, then? I thought perhaps she'd have run off to join the circus or the ministry by now." "Hermione is part of this family, Draco," Narcissa said, her tone carrying a gentle warning. "She has finished her mastery in charms with top honors. She is quite the asset." "An asset," Draco murmured, unclasping his cloak and tossing it carelessly onto a chair. "How utilitarian." He moved toward the drink cart, pouring himself a glass of amber liquid. The movement was fluid, predatory. Hermione remained by the door, unsure if she was dismissed or trapped. The air in the room was thick with unspoken things, old resentments, new curiosities, and the heavy, suffocating weight of the Malfoy legacy. "Dinner will be served in 10 minutes, Lucius announced, breaking the tension with his usual dry authority. "Do try to make yourself presentable, Draco. You look like you've dragged yourself through a hedge." Draco took a sip of his drink, his eyes finding Hermione's again over the rim of the crystal glass. A corner of his mouth ticked up, not a smile, but a challenge. "I'll manage, Father. I'd hate to ruin the aesthetic Granger has worked so hard to maintain." Dinner was a silent battlefield. The only sounds were the clinking of silver against fine china and the crackling of the fire. The long mahogany table felt like a vast wasteland separating them. Hermione sat opposite Draco, keeping her eyes on her plate, dissecting her roasted pheasant with surgical precision. She could feel his gaze on her. It was heavy, persistent. Every time she lifted her glass of water, she felt him watching the column of her throat. Every time she sliced the meat, she felt him analyzing the movement of her hands. "So," Draco said suddenly, the sound startlingly loud. "Charms, a soft magic." Hermione looked up, meeting his eyes. He was leaning back in his chair, swirling the wine in his glass, looking bored, yet dangerous. "Complex magic," she corrected him softly. "It requires precision, intent, and an understanding of the fundamental laws of reality." "And do you understand reality, Granger?" He tilted his head, a lock of platinum hair falling into his eyes. "Or do you just understand the rules Mother taught you?" Lucius sighed, looking weary. "Draco, do not start. I'm just making conversation, Father. It's been 2 years. I want to know who is living in my house." He looked back at Hermione, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You've become quiet. You used to be louder, more annoying, always quoting textbooks. I learned that silence is often more prudent than speech," Hermione said, her voice cool. "Especially in this house." Draco's eyes flashed. For a second, she saw something ignite behind the grey, a spark of anger, or perhaps intrigue. "Prudent," he scoffed. "You sound like a pureblood. It's unsettling." "I sound like someone who survived," she thought, but she didn't say it. She simply offered him a tight, polite smile. "I am merely respectful of the hospitality I have been shown." "Hospitality?" Draco laughed, a dry, humourless sound. "Is that what we call it? I thought it was a pet project, a charity case to clean the family name." "That is enough." Narcissa's voice was sharp now, cutting through the air like a whip. "Draco, you are tired. Hermione, perhaps you would like to retire to the library." It was a dismissal, and Hermione took it as a lifeline. She stood gracefully, placing her napkin on the table. "Of course. Good night, Lucius, Narcissa." She hesitated, then looked at Draco. "Good night, Draco." He didn't answer. He just watched her, his eyes dark and unreadable, as she turned and walked out of the room, her back straight, her dignity wrapped around her like a shield. She could feel his gaze burning a hole between her shoulder blades until the heavy doors swung shut behind her. The library was her sanctuary. 2 stories high, filled with the smell of old parchment and leather, it was the only place in the manor where she felt she could breathe. She didn't light the lamps. The storm outside provided enough illumination, flashes of lightning casting long, dancing shadows across the rows of books. Hermione moved to her favourite spot, a window seat nestled in an alcove hidden by a towering shelf of dark arts encyclopedias. She curled up, pulling her knees to her chest, finally letting the mask slip. Her hands were shaking. He hated her. That was expected. But there was something else in his eyes tonight, something that terrified her more than hatred. He had looked at her as if he were trying to find a crack in the porcelain, a flaw he could exploit. He had looked at her with hunger, not for her, but for a fight, for a reaction. She closed her eyes, resting her forehead against the cool glass of the window. "Ignore him," she told herself. "He will get bored. He always does." "Hiding." The voice came from the shadows, smooth and low. Hermione gasped, her legs swinging down as she spun around. Draco was leaning against the bookshelf, his arms crossed over his chest. He had discarded his jacket and tie. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the pale skin of his throat. He looked ethereal in the lightning flashes, a ghost made of sharp angles and malice. "I am reading," she said, her voice struggling to find its footing. "In the dark." He pushed off the shelf and took a step toward her. "Impressive. I was thinking." "About me? Don't flatter yourself." He chuckled darkly and took another step. He was too close now. He invaded her personal space with the ease of someone who owned everything in the room, including the air she breathed. Hermione pressed her back against the window, trapped between the storm outside and the storm in front of her. "You're lying, Granger," he murmured. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face. She flinched, expecting a blow or a shove. Instead, his fingers ghosted over the sleeve of her dress, touching the silk. "You're terrified. I can smell it on you." "I'm not afraid of you," she lied, lifting her chin. "You should be." His eyes dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. The air between them crackled, electric and heavy. "You walk around this house like you're one of us. You wear our clothes, you eat our food, you speak with my mother's cadence. It's disturbing. I do what I must to survive. Is that what this is? Survival?" He stepped closer, his body heat radiating toward her, smelling of rain, cedar, and expensive whiskey. He placed a hand on the window frame next to her head, boxing her in. "You've painted yourself over, Granger. You've covered up all that messy, mudblood humanity with a layer of Malfoy lacquer. But I wonder. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. She could feel his breath on her cheek. Her heart was hammering so hard, she was sure he could hear it. I wonder what happens if I scratch the surface. Hermione stared at him, her breath caught in her throat. His eyes were searching hers, frantic and intense, looking for the girl he used to torment, looking for the fire he remembered. "You won't find anything, Draco," she whispered. "The girl you knew is gone." "We'll see," he said softly. He held her gaze for a second longer, a second that felt like an eternity, and then pulled back abruptly. The cold rushed in to replace his warmth. "Get out of my library," he said, his voice flat and bored again. "I want to be alone." Hermione didn't argue. She slipped past him, careful not to brush against him, and fled the room. She didn't run, but she walked with a speed that betrayed her composure. As she reached the corridor, she touched her cheek where his breath had lingered. Her skin was burning. Back in the library, Draco Malfoy stood by the window, watching her reflection disappear from the glass. He brought his hand up, looking at his fingers, the fingers that had almost touched her skin. His hand clenched into a fist. She was perfect, cold, distant, obedient, and he wanted to shatter her into a million pieces just to see if she would bleed red. The morning sun at Malfoy Manor did not burst through the windows. It bled through the heavy velvet drapes in pale anemic ribbons, offering light without warmth. Hermione woke before the house stirred. This was her time, the grey hour, the stillness between the settling of the dust and the waking of the ghosts. She dressed with the same military precision she applied to her spell work. The buttons of her high-collared blouse were fastened all the way to her throat, a physical barrier against the world. Her hair, once a wild, unmanageable mane, was tamed into a sleek, intricate braid that coiled against the nape of her neck like a sleeping serpent. Narcissa had insisted on the hairstyle. "Control your hair, Hermione, and you control how they perceive you. Wildness suggests weakness." She was a creature of manufactured perfection now, a mudblood encased in pure-blood porcelain. Descending the grand staircase, her footsteps made no sound on the runner. She knew the manor's rhythm, the groan of the settling timber in the west wing, the murmur of the house elves in the kitchens, the way the portraits feigned sleep while watching through slitted eyes. But today, the rhythm was broken. The scent of strong coffee and ozone drifted from the dining room. He was up. Hermione paused at the threshold, her hand tightening on the doorframe until her knuckles turned white. She had hoped to eat alone, to vanish into the conservatory before the masters of the house descended. But Draco sat at the head of the table, Lucius's seat, a daily prophet spread out before him, though he wasn't reading it. He looked worse than he had the night before. The morning light was unkind to him, highlighting the shadows beneath his eyes and the tension in his jaw. He wore a black silk dressing gown over his trousers, looking both regal and ruined, like a fallen prince surveying the ashes of his kingdom. "Hovering," he said without looking up. His voice was a rasp of sandpaper over stone. "It's unbecoming." Hermione stepped into the room, her expression smoothed into pleasant neutrality. "Good morning, Draco. I did not realize you rose so early." "I haven't slept," he muttered, finally lifting his gaze. His eyes were bloodshot, the grey iris clouded. He looked at her with a mixture of exhaustion and that same sharp, probing disgust from the library. "And don't call me that. It sounds wrong coming from your mouth." "What would you prefer?" She moved to her usual seat midway down the table and poured herself tea. The china clinked softly, a sound that seemed to grate on his nerves. "Malfoy? Heir? Master?" "Master has a nice ring to it," he sneered, folding the newspaper with a sharp snap. "But I suppose Malfoy will suffice. It reminds you of who you aren't." Hermione took a sip of tea, the bergamot bitter on her tongue. She didn't flinch. She didn't frown. She simply set the cup down and looked at him. "As you wish, Malfoy." He stared at her, waiting for the crack. He wanted her to snap, to throw the tea in his face, to stomp her foot like the Gryffindor he remembered from school stories. But that girl had been eroded by 5 years of Narcissa's icy tutelage. "You've taken my seat," he said suddenly. Hermione blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "That chair." "It faces the window. I used to sit there." "You haven't sat there since you were 15, she pointed out gently. "Lucius prefers you on his right. I want it." It was petty. It was childish. It was a test. Hermione stood up slowly. She picked up her plate and her cup, her movements fluid and devoid of irritation. She walked around the table to the seat opposite him, in the shadows, and sat down. "Better?" she asked. Draco watched her, his lip curling. He hadn't won. Her compliance wasn't submission. It was indifference. She had treated his demand like one treats a tantruming child, with placating silence. It infuriated him. "You're pathetic," he spat, standing up so abruptly his chair screeched against the floor. "Do you have no pride? No spine? You just bend and bend and bend." "I survive," she said, cutting her toast into 4 perfect triangles. "There is a difference between bending and breaking, Malfoy. You would do well to learn it." He stormed out, his robes billowing behind him like storm clouds. Hermione watched him go, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Only when the door clicked shut did she allow her hand to tremble, just once, before she picked up her fork. By midday, the rain had returned, wrapping the estate in a shroud of grey mist. Hermione sought refuge in the conservatory, a glass-domed cathedral attached to the east wing. It was her domain, a humid, verdant jungle where the air smelled of damp earth, crushing petals and subtle poisons. Narcissa had given her charge of the rare magical flora. It was a test of trust. Many of these plants could kill a man in seconds. Hermione found peace in their danger. They were honest. A venomous tentacula didn't pretend to be kind. It simply hungered. She was pruning a devil's snare that had grown too aggressive, humming a soft, tuneless melody under her breath. Her wand was tucked away. She used her hands, gloved in dragon hide, and a small silver knife. She coaxed the vines back, whispering incantations that soothed the plant's violent instincts. "I didn't know we kept a gardener." The voice cut through the humidity, sharp and cold. Hermione stiffened, but didn't turn. She could feel him behind her, his presence a sudden drop in pressure in the warm room. "I tend the plants myself," she said, slicing a dead tendril. "The house elves are afraid of them." "And you aren't?" Draco moved into her peripheral vision. He had dressed, exchanging the dressing gown for a fitted black shirt and trousers. He looked like a shadow moving through the vibrant green of the jungle. He stopped beside her, looking down at the writhing mass of the devil's snare. "Fear is useful," Hermione said. "It keeps you alert. Panic is what kills you." "Is that another one of Mother's aphorisms?" He reached out, his hand hovering dangerously close to a seeking vine. "You quote her like a scripture. She taught me how to live in this world." "She taught you how to be a mimic." Draco sneered, withdrawing his hand and turning to face her. The space between the planting tables was narrow. They were forced into an intimacy neither wanted. "Look at you. You prune the roses, you pour the tea, you wear the silk. But you're just playing house, aren't you? Waiting for the moment they realize you're just a..." He trailed off, the slur hanging in the air. "Say it," Hermione said softly, finally meeting his gaze. Her eyes were brown and hard, like river stones. "If it makes you feel better, if it makes you feel big." Draco's jaw worked. He looked at her mouth, then her eyes. He seemed at war with himself, the pure-blood heir who should hate her, and the broken boy who was fascinated by her stillness. "You think you're safe here," he murmured, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You think because Mother likes having a doll to dress up, you're protected. But she won't be here forever. And Father tolerates you." "But I..." He took a step closer, crowding her against the stone bench. The heat in the conservatory seemed to spike. "I don't know what you are," he admitted, almost to himself. "And I don't like things I don't understand. I am not a thing to be understood, Draco. I am a person." "Are you?" He raised his hand. For a split second, Hermione thought he would strike her. Her body tensed, her instincts screaming, "Defend, defend." But he didn't strike. He flicked his fingers. Non-verbal magic. The pot of bubotuber pus on the shelf above her head exploded. It was a childish prank, meant to humiliate, to cover her in the foul-smelling, acidic slime. It was meant to break the porcelain doll. But the slime never touched her. In the fraction of a second between the explosion and the impact, Hermione didn't reach for her wand. She didn't scream. She simply pushed. A shimmering, translucent barrier of pure magic flared into existence around her, a bubble of force that repelled the liquid. The yellow slime splashed harmlessly against the shield and slid to the floor, hissing as it ate into the stone. Silence descended on the conservatory. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of the acid. Hermione stood amidst the mess, completely dry, her chest heaving slightly. She hadn't used a wand. She hadn't spoken a spell. It was accidental magic, or rather, wandless magic, born of pure survivalist instinct. Draco stared at her. His eyes were wide, the boredom and malice wiped away, replaced by genuine shock. He looked from the sizzling floor to her face, re-evaluating. "Wandless," he breathed. It wasn't an accusation, it was a revelation. Hermione dropped the shield. Her knees felt weak. Showing power was dangerous. Power made you a threat. "Clean it up," she said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Excuse me? You made the mess. Clean it up." She stepped forward, invading his space this time. The anger she had bottled up for 2 days, for 10 years, flared hot and bright. She poked a gloved finger into his chest, right over his heart. He was so stunned he didn't even recoil. "You think you can come back here and break things just because you're unhappy," she hissed. "You think because you're broken, you have the right to smash everything else. I am not one of your toys, Draco Malfoy, and I am not your punching bag. If you want to fight, find someone who can hit back, but do not mistake my silence for weakness. Never do that." She held his gaze for 1 heartbeat, 2, 3. The air crackled between them, thick with magic and adrenaline. He smelled of rain and arrogance, but beneath it, she caught the scent of fear. He was afraid of her, or perhaps afraid of what she represented, that the world he knew was a lie. She turned on her heel and marched out of the conservatory, leaving him standing in the wreckage of his own malice. Draco remained motionless for a long time. He looked down at his chest where she had touched him. The fabric still felt warm. He looked at the sizzling puddle on the floor, wandless shielding, reflexive, powerful. A slow, twisted smile touched his lips. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had just found a worthy opponent. "Granger," he whispered to the humid air. She wasn't a pet. She was a predator in a silk dress. And for the first time since returning to this mausoleum of a home, Draco Malfoy felt something other than numbness. He felt the thrill of the hunt. Dinner that night was different. The silence was still there, but the quality of it had changed. It was no longer the silence of avoidance. It was the silence of a duel. Draco sat across from her, freshly showered, wearing impeccable dress robes. He ate with mechanical grace. But every time Hermione looked up, she found him watching her. He wasn't glaring anymore. He was observing. He was studying her hands, the way she held her fork, the way she breathed. It was unnerving. It was intimate in a way that made her skin prickle. "I heard there was an accident in the conservatory," Lucius remarked, swirling his wine. "A bubotuber burst?" Hermione opened her mouth to speak, to take the blame as she always did to keep the peace. "I was clumsy. I dropped it." "I knocked it over," Draco said calmly. Hermione froze. Narcissa looked up, her blue eyes sharp. Lucius paused. "Clumsy of you," Lucius sneered. "Yes," Draco agreed, his eyes locking onto Hermione's across the centerpiece of white roses. "I underestimated the environment. I'll be more careful next time." "See that you are," Lucius dismissed. Hermione stared at Draco. He offered her a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't an apology. It was an acknowledgement. "I see you now." She looked back down at her plate, her heart racing. The game had changed. He wasn't just trying to break her anymore. He was trying to figure out how she worked. And she wasn't sure which was more dangerous, his hatred or his attention. Later that night, as she brushed her hair before the mirror, she saw a small package sitting on her vanity. There was no note. Inside was a jar of high-quality burn paste and a single crushed petal from a venomous tentacula. A warning? A peace offering? Or a promise? Hermione touched the petal, feeling the ghost of a sting. The ice was cracking, but what lay beneath the water was dark, deep, and full of teeth. The petal of the venomous tentacula sat on Hermione's bedside table for 3 days. It was a dark, bruised purple, curling at the edges like a drying wound. To anyone else, it was compost. To Hermione, it was a gauntlet thrown down on white satin. She didn't thank him. That would be a surrender. Instead, she left a book on his usual chair in the dining room the next morning. The Toxins of the Soul, a study in magical residue. She had bookmarked a chapter on the cowardice of the unspoken. He didn't mention it, but when she returned to the library that evening, the book was gone. The truce, if it could be called that, was fragile. It was built not on kindness, but on a mutual, unspoken recognition of boredom. Malfoy Manor was a tomb of etiquette and silence. Lucius spoke only of politics and legacy. Narcissa spoke of arrangements and decorum. There was no air, no fire. Draco and Hermione were the only things burning in the house. It began on a Tuesday, deep in the heavy velvet hours of the night. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a stillness so profound it felt like the world was holding its breath. Hermione was in the library, naturally. She was decoding a complex arithmancy chart she had found tucked into a dusty tome on 15th century warding. "You're calculating the vector wrong." Hermione didn't jump this time. She finished writing the rune for stability before she looked up. Draco was there, leaning against the opposing side of the long oak table. He was holding a glass of fire whiskey, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, exposing the dark mark. He didn't hide it anymore, nor did he flaunt it. It was just there, a scar on the landscape of his skin. "I am not," she said calmly. "I'm adjusting for the ambient magical density of the manor. The standard equations assume a neutral environment. This house is saturated with centuries of dark residue." Draco raised an eyebrow, a flicker of genuine interest lighting his eyes. He set his glass down and walked around the table to stand behind her shoulder. He didn't touch her, but his heat radiated against her back, a tangible weight. "The manor breathes," he murmured, looking down at her parchment. "You think you can calculate its mood? I think magic follows laws, even if they are obscure." She tapped the parchment with her quill. "Here, the intersection of the ley line and the wardstone. If I use the standard variable, the equation collapses. But if I use the chaotic variable, it stabilizes," he finished. He reached over her shoulder, his long, pale finger tracing the line of ink she had drawn. "Clever. Reckless, but clever. You're assuming the chaos is constant." "Is it?" she asked, turning her head slightly. His face was inches from hers. She could see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes, the faint stubble along his jaw. He smelled of parchment and that sharp, expensive soap. "No," he said softly. "The chaos is temperamental." He pulled back, walking to the shelf and pulling down a heavy, iron-bound book. He slammed it onto the table, dust motes dancing in the candlelight. "If you want to understand the manor, Granger, stop looking at math. Look at intent." He flipped the book open. "My great-grandfather, Abraxas. He didn't build wards with numbers. He built them with blood and will." "And that's why they're failing," Hermione countered, her voice rising with the thrill of the debate. "Because will is finite. Equations are eternal." "Will is power," he snapped, his eyes flashing. "Equations are just a cage you build to feel safe. You think because you can measure something, you can control it. That's your flaw, Granger. You think the world is a test you can ace. And you think the world is a beast you can whip," she shot back, standing up. They were facing each other now across the table, the air between them vibrating. It wasn't the cold animosity of the dining room. This was hot. It was intellectual violence. "Prove it," Draco challenged. "Cast the ward. Use your equation." "I can't cast a ward of this magnitude inside the manor. It would trigger the alarms." "Scared? Prudent? Boring." He picked up his wand from the table, twirling it between his fingers. "I'll dampen the internal sensors. Just the room. Do it. Let's see if your chaotic variable holds." Hermione stared at him. It was a trap. It had to be. But the challenge sang in her blood. She hadn't used real, complex magic in weeks. She was starving for it. "If I blow up the east wing, it's on your head," she warned. "I'll put it on my tab." He smirked, a crooked, dangerous thing that made her stomach flip. He waved his wand, muttering a complex silencing ward around the library. The hum of the house faded, leaving them in a bubble of absolute silence. "Go on then, witch." Hermione took a breath, centering herself. She didn't need the wand movements. She knew the theory. She focused on the equation, the beautiful, terrifying logic of it. She raised her wand. Presidium Aeternum. The magic didn't burst. It flowed. A dome of shimmering, golden light erupted from her wand tip, expanding to encompass the table. It was beautiful, geometric, perfect. Draco watched, his eyes critical. He didn't look impressed. He looked analytical. He raised his own wand. "Now," he whispered, "let's introduce the chaos." He didn't cast a counterspell. He cast a curse. A dark, violet bolt of energy slammed into her shield. Hermione gasped, bracing her feet as the impact shuddered through her arm. "What are you doing?" "Testing the variable," he shouted over the crackle of magic. He cast again, harder this time. "Your equation assumes the attack is external, blunt force. What if it's insidious?" The violet light changed, turning into a green, acidic smoke that began to eat at her golden shield. The geometry of her spell started to warp. "You're cheating!" she yelled, pouring more power into the shield. Sweat prickled at her hairline. "There are no rules in a duel, Granger. Adapt or die." He was enjoying this. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the fierce concentration on his face. He was attacking her mind as much as her magic. He was forcing her to abandon the textbook. Hermione grit her teeth. He was right. The equation was rigid. The smoke was finding the cracks in the logic. She had to stop thinking like a mathematician and start thinking like a Malfoy. She dropped the structure of the spell. Instead of a wall, she made it a net. She visualized the shield not as a barrier, but as a sponge. The golden light softened, becoming porous. When Draco's dark magic hit it, instead of shattering, the shield absorbed it. Hermione groaned with the effort, channeling his energy, twisting it, repurposing it. Draco's eyes went wide. He felt the pull. "What are you?" "Returning to sender," she gritted out. With a flick of her wrist, she reversed the polarity. The absorbed magic, now mixed with her own, exploded outward in a shockwave of blinding white light. It hit Draco square in the chest. He flew backward, crashing into a stack of armchairs. Books toppled from the shelves, parchment fluttered like dying birds, and the silence of the room was shattered by the sound of falling heavy objects. Hermione stood panting, her wand raised, her hair escaping its pins to float wildly around her face in the residual static. Silence returned, thick and dusty. "Draco!" she called out, a sudden spike of fear piercing her adrenaline. A groan from the pile of chairs. Draco sat up, rubbing his chest. His shirt was singed, his hair a mess. He looked dazed. He looked up at her. Hermione braced herself for the anger, for the slur, for the threat to call his father. Draco started to laugh. It was a rusty, jagged sound, as if he hadn't used it in years. He leaned his head back against the overturned chair and laughed until he was wheezing. "You completely insane witch!" he gasped. Hermione lowered her wand, her heart still hammering. "You attacked me." And you turned my own hex into a battery. He shook his head, wiping a smear of dust from his cheek. He looked at her then, really looked at her, with a terrifying clarity. The mask was gone. The boredom was gone. I haven't felt a magical kick like that since... He trailed off. Since before. He stood up, wincing slightly, and dusted off his trousers. He walked back to the table, which was miraculously unharmed. He picked up her parchment, which was now singed at the edges. "Your equation was wrong," he said, his voice quiet now. "I know," she admitted, her hands trembling as the adrenaline faded. "I had to improvise." "No." He looked at her, his grey eyes intense. "The equation was wrong because you didn't account for the partner." Hermione froze. "Partner?" "Magic like that." He gestured between them. "Doesn't happen in a vacuum, Granger. You can't calculate the outcome if you don't know who you're dancing with." He stepped closer, invading her space again. This time she didn't retreat. The air was charged with the smell of ozone and burnt sugar. "We destroyed the reading nook," she whispered, looking at the mess. "I'll have the elves fix it." He didn't look at the mess. He was looking at a curl of hair that had fallen over her eye. His hand twitched, as if he wanted to tuck it back, but he clenched it into a fist at his side. "You're not just a bookworm, are you?" he murmured, underneath all that starch and decorum. "I told you," she said, her voice barely audible. "I survive." "No." Draco shook his head slowly. "Survival is boring. That..." He nodded toward the singed chair. "That was war. That was art." He picked up his glass of fire whiskey, which had somehow survived the blast, and downed the rest of it in one swallow. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked, his voice rough. Hermione looked at him, at the soot on his cheek, the life in his eyes, the challenge in his stance. For the first time in this house, she didn't feel like an orphan or a guest. She felt like a contender. "Bring a stronger shield," she replied. Draco smirked, a genuine, sharp thing that made him look dangerously handsome. "Don't get cocky, Granger. I went easy on you." He turned and walked out of the library, leaving her standing in the wreckage, her blood singing a song she hadn't heard in a very long time. The nights became their kingdom. While Lucius drank in his study and Narcissa slept in her silk-draped room, the library became a battlefield. They didn't just duel with magic, they dueled with everything. They debated magical theory until dawn, their voices hushed but fierce. They argued over history, over ethics, over the translation of ancient runes. Draco was brilliant, sharper than she had ever given him credit for, his mind a steel trap of pure-blood lore and dark theory. Hermione was relentless, her logic a battering ram that chipped away at his prejudices. They played a game of intellectual strip poker, though neither would ever call it that. Every night, a layer was peeled back. "You quote the law," Draco said one night, tracing the rim of his glass. "But you don't believe in it." "I believe in justice," Hermione argued, her eyes tired but bright. "The law is just a tool. And when the tool is broken, then you forge a new one. Is that what you're doing here?" He looked at her, his gaze penetrating. "Forging yourself into something new?" "Maybe." She looked away. "Maybe I'm just trying not to rust." "You're not rusting, Granger," he said softly. "You're sharpening." The distance between them was shrinking. Not physically, they still kept the table between them like a shield, but emotionally. The silence that fell between their arguments was no longer empty. It was heavy with things they couldn't say. Hermione found herself watching his hands, long, elegant fingers that could cast a Cruciatus or turn a delicate page with equal ease. She found herself waiting for that rare, dry laugh. And Draco. Draco watched her like she was a riddle he was terrifyingly close to solving. But the world outside the library was creeping in. One morning at breakfast, 2 weeks after the duel, Lucius looked up from his paper. "The Yule Ball," he announced. "The Ministry is hosting a gala, a show of unity." He sneered the word. "We are expected to attend." Hermione felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "All of us?" Draco asked, his voice flat. "Yes." Lucius looked at Hermione. His eyes were cold, assessing. "It will be a good opportunity to show the world our magnanimity. Hermione will attend with us." Hermione looked down at her plate. To be paraded, to be the pet on display. "She needs new robes," Draco said suddenly. Hermione looked up, surprised. Lucius frowned. "Narcissa has plenty of old—" "No," Draco cut his father off. His voice was firm, carrying a tone of authority that made Lucius blink. "If she is to represent the House of Malfoy, she cannot look like she's wearing Mother's cast-offs. She needs to look—" He looked at Hermione across the table. His eyes were unreadable, but for a second she thought she saw a flash of possessiveness. "She needs to look untouchable." Lucius held his son's gaze for a long moment, then shrugged. "Very well. Take her to Twilfit and Tattings, but keep it within reason." Draco nodded. "I'll handle it." Hermione's heart raced. A trip to Diagon Alley, with Draco, alone. It felt like a reward. It felt like walking onto a precipice. "Don't look so terrified, Granger," Draco murmured as he passed her chair on his way out. His hand brushed her shoulder, a fleeting, accidental touch that burned through the silk of her blouse. "I have no intention of letting you embarrass me." But as she watched him walk away, Hermione knew it wasn't embarrassment he was worried about. He was arming her. He was preparing her for war. And for the first time, she wasn't sure whose side she was on. Twilfit and Tattings was a cathedral of vanity. It smelled of lavender starch, raw silk, and the quiet, desperate desire to be admired. Unlike the chaotic bustle of Madame Malkin's, this shop was a hushed sanctuary where the air was always cool and the mirrors were charmed to flatter, though they could not hide the truth of one's lineage. Hermione stood on the raised dais, her arms held slightly away from her sides, feeling like a doll being unboxed. Too frilly. Draco's voice cut through the silence from the velvet armchair in the corner. He didn't look up from the fabric swatches he was idly flipping through, but his disapproval was palpable. The seamstress, a nervous witch with pins floating around her head like a halo, fluttered. "But, sir, the lace is imported from Brussels. It softens the—" "She doesn't need softening," Draco snapped, finally lifting his gaze. He looked at Hermione, really looked at her, with that same terrifying analytical intensity he used in the library. "She isn't a debutante making her first curtsy. She's a statement." Hermione caught his eye in the mirror. Her heart did a traitorous little flip. For years, she had been dressed by Narcissa in pastels and pearls, designed to make her look harmless, grateful, soft. Draco was looking for something else. He stood up, tossing the swatches aside, and stalked toward the racks of unfinished gowns. He moved with the prowling grace of a predator who owned the jungle. His fingers trailed over silks and velvets until he stopped. This one. He pulled out a gown of midnight blue, so dark it was almost black, but under the light it shimmered with the depth of a starless sky. The fabric was heavy, liquid satin. "Go try it on," he commanded, thrusting the hanger toward the seamstress. Then he looked at Hermione, his voice dropping to a murmur only she could hear. "And fix your posture, Granger. You're slouching." When she emerged from the fitting room 10 minutes later, the air in the shop seemed to vanish. The dress was a masterpiece of structural magic. It fit her like a second skin, the bodice structured and tight, pushing her breasts up slightly, the neckline plunging just enough to be daring, but stopping short of scandalous. The sleeves were long and fitted, ending in points over her hands, while the back was entirely open, exposing the line of her spine. She stepped back onto the dais. The silence stretched. Draco stood slowly. He didn't sneer. He didn't smirk. His face was completely blank, stripped of all expression, which was how Hermione knew he was affected. He walked up to the dais, stepping into her personal space. The seamstress wisely retreated to the back room. "Turn around," he whispered. Hermione obeyed, the heavy silk swishing around her legs. She felt the coolness of the air on her exposed back, and then heat. Draco's knuckles grazed her spine, tracing the vertebrae from her shoulder blades down to the curve of her waist. It wasn't a sexual touch, not explicitly. It was possessive. It was the touch of a sculptor checking for flaws in the marble. Hermione stopped breathing. Her skin erupted in goose flesh where he touched her. "You have a scar here," he murmured, his finger pausing over a faint white line on her ribcage, a souvenir from the war. "I have many scars," she whispered, looking at his reflection in the mirror. He was standing right behind her, his dark suit contrasting with her pale skin. They looked formidable. They looked like a pair of kings and queens on a chessboard. "Good," he said, his eyes meeting hers in the glass. The grey was darkening, swirling like a storm. "Don't hide them. Narcissa tries to paint you over. I want them to see the cracks." He leaned in closer, his breath ghosting over her ear. "Tonight, you are not the ward. You are the warning." For a moment, just a fleeting, impossible moment, Hermione thought he was going to kiss the sensitive cord of her neck. She leaned back infinitesimally into his touch. The tension was a pulled bowstring, humming, dangerous. Then he stepped back, the cold rushing in to replace him. "Wrap it up," he called out to the empty shop, his voice flat and bored again. "And send the bill to my vault. We're leaving." The Ministry Yule Ball was a suffocating ocean of gold light, enchanted snow, and forced laughter. The great atrium had been transformed into a winter wonderland, but the magic felt brittle. The war had been over for years, but the alliances were still shifting, the old prejudices merely wearing new masks. Hermione walked in on Draco's arm. She felt the eyes immediately, hundreds of them. They prickled against her skin like needles. Usually she would shrink, making herself small, hiding in Narcissa's shadow. But tonight, the midnight blue silk held her upright. The corset was armor, and the hand on her elbow was an anchor. Draco navigated the crowd with lethal precision. He didn't weave. People parted for him. He was the Malfoy heir, restored, wealthy and dangerous. And she was, what? His trophy? His provocation? "Chin up," he muttered as they passed a group of whispering witches. "If you look down, they'll think you're apologizing for existing." "I'm not apologizing," Hermione replied through gritted teeth, fixing a radiant, fake smile on her face. "Good. Smile like you know something they don't." They moved through the reception, greeting dignitaries. Lucius and Narcissa were elsewhere, holding court near the minister. For now, it was just Draco and Hermione. And for the first time in her life in the magical world, Hermione didn't feel like an outsider. She felt tethered. They danced. A waltz, slow and formal. Draco's hand was firm on her waist, his other hand clasping hers. They moved in perfect synchronization, years of Narcissa's lessons paying off, or perhaps it was the nights in the library, learning each other's rhythms. "You're trembling," Draco noted, spinning her past a pillar. "I hate crowds. Focus on me." Hermione looked up. His face was close, his expression focused. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking only at her. "I am," she whispered. Something flickered in his eyes, a crack in the ice. He pulled her slightly closer, breaking the proper distance required for a formal waltz. Her chest brushed against his robes. The scent of him, cedar, rain, and expensive spice, filled her senses. "They're terrified of you," he said softly, a note of dark pride in his voice. "Look at them, Granger. They don't know what to make of a mudblood who looks like a queen." "Draco." "Let them look," he vowed, his grip tightening on her hand. "Let them choke on it." It was intoxicating. For 1 hour, Hermione allowed herself to believe it. She believed that the library wasn't just a truce, but a beginning. She believed that the way he looked at her in the fitting room meant he saw her, not just a tool to annoy his father. She let herself feel the warmth of his hand and the strength of his body shielding her from the room. But gravity always wins. The music ended. They parted, breathless. Hermione felt flushed, her eyes shining. She reached for a glass of champagne from a floating tray, feeling almost giddy. "Draco, darling." The voice was high, shrill, and dripping with false sweetness. Pansy Parkinson materialized from the crowd, looking like a sleek black cat in emerald velvet. Beside her stood Theodore Knott and, more ominously, Lucius Malfoy. The bubble burst. "Pansy," Draco said, his voice cooling instantly. He stepped back, putting a polite distance between himself and Hermione. "We were just watching you dance," Pansy crooned, stepping into the circle. She glanced at Hermione, her eyes raking over the blue dress with undisguised envy and malice. It was quaint, like watching someone walk a particularly well-trained dog. Hermione stiffened. The insult was old, tired. She could handle Pansy. She looked to Draco, waiting for the sharp retort, the wit he had displayed in the library. But Draco was looking at Lucius. His father was standing with the Minister of Magic and several members of the Sacred 28. Lucius's face was a mask of cold fury. He gave a microscopic shake of his head. A command. "Distance yourself. Now." The pressure in the air shifted. The crowd around them had gone quiet, sensing blood. They were waiting to see if the Malfoy heir had truly gone soft, if he had truly been seduced by the charity case. "Father was concerned," Theo Knott drawled, swirling his drink. "He thought you were getting a bit too attached to the help." Draco's jaw clenched. He looked at Hermione. She looked back, her eyes open, trusting. We are partners, she thought. We are the chaos variable. Attached? Draco repeated. He let out a short, harsh laugh. It sounded like glass breaking. He turned to the group, turning his back slightly to Hermione. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. Don't be ridiculous, Theo, Draco drawled, his voice loud enough to carry to the nearby listeners. One doesn't get attached to a project. One simply ensures it doesn't embarrass the family name. Hermione felt the blood drain from her face. The cold from the manor rushed back in, freezing her marrow. Project? Pansy tittered. Is that what we're calling it? She looks like she thinks she's your date. Draco took a sip of his drink, looking bored. Granger, a date? He smirked, but his eyes were dead. She's a ward of the manor, nothing more. Mother insisted she get some air. I'm just managing the inventory. Inventory? The word hung in the air, grotesque and heavy. The crowd chuckled, a ripple of relieved laughter. Oh, good. He's still one of us. He still knows his place. She is still just a thing. Hermione stood frozen. The beautiful midnight blue dress suddenly felt like a costume. The corset felt like a cage. The scar on her arm burned. She looked at Draco's profile. He was staring straight ahead, his knuckles white around his glass. He had done what he had to do. He had protected the Malfoy reputation. He had played the part, but he had killed the girl in the library. I see, Hermione said. Her voice was steady, though her world was crumbling. Draco flinched, just barely. He turned his head, meeting her eyes. For a second, she saw the panic there, the silent plea. Understand this. It's a game. I had to, but Hermione wasn't playing anymore. I apologize for the confusion, she said, her voice ringing clear and cold as a bell in the sudden silence. I was under the impression that manners were a sign of breeding. It seems I was mistaken. She didn't wait for a reaction. She didn't wait for Lucius's anger or Pansy's retort. She turned on her heel, the heavy silk whipping around her legs, and walked away. She walked through the parting crowd, head high, spine straight, showing them the scar on her back. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She walked out of the ballroom, down the long marble corridor, and out into the snowy night. Only when the heavy doors slammed shut, muting the music and the laughter, did she allow herself to lean against the stone pillar. She gasped for air, her hands clutching the rough stone. The cold winter air bit at her exposed skin, but it was nothing compared to the freeze in her chest. Inside the ballroom, Draco Malfoy watched the doors close. The glass in his hand shattered, slicing his palm. Draco? Pansy asked, startled. He didn't answer. He stared at the blood welling up in his hand, dark and red against the pale skin. It was the only real thing in the room. He had won. He had satisfied his father. He had kept his social standing. And he felt like he had just carved out his own heart. The silence that descended upon Malfoy Manor in the weeks following the Yule Ball was not peaceful. It was necrotic. It was the silence of a limb that had gone gangrenous, turning black and cold while the body pretended it was still whole. Hermione Granger had vanished. Oh, her body was still there. She still sat at the breakfast table, spine rigid, hands folded in her lap. She still poured tea for Narcissa with a steady hand. She still walked the corridors, a ghost in grey wool, her footsteps soundless on the plush carpets. But the girl who had debated arithmancy until 3 in the morning, the girl who had turned a hex into a battery, The girl who had worn midnight blue silk like armor. She was gone. Draco had killed her. He knew this with the certainty of a coroner standing over a corpse. He sat in the library, staring at the empty chair opposite him. The book in front of him, Advanced Transfiguration of the Soul, hadn't been turned in an hour. The fire crackled, spitting sparks against the grate, but the warmth didn't reach him. He took a sip of fire whiskey. It burned, but not enough to distract him from the memory of her face in the ballroom, managing the inventory. The words tasted like bile. "You're brooding," a voice said from the doorway. Draco didn't look up. "Go away, Blaze." Blaze Zabini leaned against the doorframe, looking effortlessly elegant and irritatingly observant. He had come for dinner, invited by Narcissa to liven up the atmosphere, which was code for stop Draco from drinking himself into a stupor. "She's not coming, you know," Blaze said, swirling his wine. "The Granger girl. I saw her in the garden. She looks diminished." "She knows her place," Draco said, the lie slipping out automatically, a practiced reflex. "Does she?" Blaze walked into the room, his eyes sharp. "Because at school she never knew her place. That was the point of her. Now, she looks like a house elf in better clothes." He paused, watching Draco's reaction. "You broke her spirit, Draco. Congratulations. Isn't that what Lucius wanted?" Draco's hand tightened around his glass until the crystal groaned. "Leave it, Blaze." "I'm just saying. It's a waste. I rather liked the fire." "Get out." Blaze held up his hands in mock surrender and sauntered out. Draco hurled the glass into the fireplace. It shattered, the alcohol flaring up in a burst of blue flame. He stood, his chest heaving. He needed air. He didn't know what he needed. He found himself walking toward the West Wing. Her wing. He stopped outside her door. It was closed. It was always closed now. He raised a hand to knock, his fingers hovering inches from the dark wood. What would he say? "I'm sorry?" Malfoys didn't apologize. "I had to do it. A coward's excuse. I missed the fight." Pathetic. He lowered his hand and walked away, but as he turned the corner, he saw a shadow move. Lucius. His father was standing at the end of the corridor watching him. Lucius's face was a mask of cold disappointment, illuminated by the flickering torchlight. "She is a distraction," Lucius said, his voice carrying effortlessly down the hall. Draco stopped. "She is a ward. She is a liability." The minister was asking questions about why she looked at you the way she did, about why you touched her back. Lucius began to walk toward him, his cane tapping rhythmically on the stone floor. Click, click, click. "We cannot afford rumors, Draco. Not now. The Dark Lord's influence may be gone, but the stigma remains. We must be impeccable." "I handled it," Draco said stiffly. "I put her in her place. Publicly, yes, but privately." Lucius stopped a few feet away, towering over his son. "You seek her out. You defend her. You look at her as if she is something precious. I look at her as an investment." "Do not lie to me," Lucius snapped. The cane came up, not to strike, but to point, the silver snake head glinting dangerously. "I have arranged a marriage for her. A clerk in the improper use of magic office. A widower. Respectable enough to look charitable, distant enough to remove her from this house. She leaves at the end of the month." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "No," Draco said. The word hung in the air, absolute and terrifying. Lucius blinked. He looked as if the furniture had suddenly spoken back to him. "Excuse me?" "No," Draco repeated, stepping forward. He was taller than his father now, he realized with a jolt. Or perhaps Lucius had just shrunk under the weight of his own bitterness. She stays. You defy me? For a mudblood? I defy you for the House of Malfoy, Draco lied, his voice steady, though his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. She is the brightest witch of her age. Her mastery and charms brings prestige to this estate. Sending her away to some clerk looks like weakness. It looks like we are afraid of her. We should be afraid of what she represents, Lucius hissed. She is the rot in the foundation. She is the only thing in this house that is alive, Draco shouted. The silence that followed was deafening. Lucius stared at him, his eyes narrowing into slits. He saw it then. The truth. It wasn't about prestige. It wasn't about politics. You care for her, Lucius whispered. The accusation was worse than a curse. You are weak. I am pragmatic, Draco said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. She stays. If you try to move her, if you try to sell her off like cattle, I will invoke the heir's right. I will freeze the accounts. I will lock the wards. You are the lord of the manor, father, but the magic of this house answers to the blood that is strongest, and right now, that isn't you. It was a bluff, mostly, but the magic of the manor did seem to hum in response to his anger, the shadows lengthening, the torches flaring. Lucius looked at his son, seeing the stranger who had returned from the continent. He saw the danger there. He sneered, adjusting his robes. Very well, Lucius said coldly. Keep your pet, but do not expect me to tolerate her presence at my table any longer. She eats in the kitchen from now on. Fine, Draco said. Lucius turned and walked away. Draco waited until he was gone before he leaned against the wall, his legs shaking. He had saved her, and in doing so, he had banished her to the servants' quarters. He found her in the garden the next day. It was raining again, a cold, miserable drizzle that turned the world grey. Hermione was kneeling in the mud near the perimeter wall, digging up mandrake roots. She wasn't wearing her gloves. Her hands were caked in dirt, her nails broken. She wore a rough wool cloak, the hood pulled up to hide her face. Draco stood under the shelter of the patio watching her. She looked small, defeated. He walked out into the rain. He didn't cast a warming charm. He needed to feel the cold. Granger. She didn't look up. She kept digging, her movements mechanical. Master Malfoy. The title was a slap in the face. Don't call me that, he said, the water dripping from his hair into his eyes. I am following the rules, she said to the dirt. I am the inventory. Inventory does not use first names. Stop it. He reached down and grabbed her wrist. She flinched. It was a violent, full-body jerk, as if he had burned her. She pulled her arm back, scrambling away from him in the mud, her eyes wide and terrified. Draco froze. His hand remained outstretched, empty. She was afraid of him. Not wary, not angry. Afraid. Hermione, he breathed, the name feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue. I'm not going to hurt you. She stared up at him from the mud, her chest heaving. The rain plastered her hair to her skull. Her eyes were red-rimmed. You already did, she whispered. I had to, he said, the words desperate. At the ball, they were watching. If I hadn't, if I had shown them that He struggled, the emotional vocabulary of a Malfoy failing him completely. Lucius would have destroyed you. So you destroyed me first to save him the trouble. She laughed, a broken, wet sound. How efficient. "I saved you," he snapped, the anger flaring to cover the guilt. "He wanted to marry you off, to a clerk, a nobody. I stopped him. And I suppose I should be grateful." She stood up, wiping her muddy hands on her cloak. She was trembling, but her chin was high. "Thank you, Master, for keeping me in your gilded cage instead of selling me to another one." "It's not a cage, isn't it?" She gestured around the vast, gloomy garden. "I can't leave. I can't work. I can't speak unless spoken to. And the one person." Her voice cracked. She looked away, biting her lip. "The one person who treated me like an equal turned around and called me a thing in front of the entire world." She looked back at him, and the look in her eyes shattered him. It wasn't hatred. It was disappointment. Profound, crushing disappointment. "I thought you were different," she said softly. "I thought you were the chaos variable. But you're just a constant, Draco. You're just a Malfoy." She turned to walk away. "I am not him," Draco shouted. He didn't know why he was shouting. He felt like he was bleeding out. He lunged forward, grabbing her shoulders. He spun her around, pinning her against the rough stone of the garden wall. It was aggressive, yes, but he needed her to stop. He needed her to see him. "I am not him," he repeated, his voice shaking. He was close enough to see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, to smell the rain and the earth on her skin. "I hate this house. I hate what we are. But I can't burn it down, Hermione. Not yet. I have to play the game." "And I'm just a pawn," she whispered, her back pressed against the stone. She didn't fight him. She just looked at him with that terrible, passive resignation. "No," he groaned, leaning his forehead against hers. He closed his eyes. "You are not a pawn. You are the queen. Don't you see that? If they know you matter to me, they will use you to break me." He felt her breath hitch. "Matter to you?" she breathed. Draco pulled back slightly, looking at her mouth. The rain dripped from his nose onto her cheek. He wanted to kiss her. The urge was so strong it was physical pain. He wanted to kiss the cold from her lips, to taste the mud and the rain, to claim her in a way that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with surrender. But he couldn't. Not here, not yet. "You are the only real thing I have," he whispered. He let her go. He stepped back, the loss of contact leaving him cold. Hermione stood against the wall, her eyes searching his face. The fear was gone, replaced by confusion. And something else. A spark. A tiny, fragile ember in the ashes. "Go inside," he said roughly. "You'll catch your death." She didn't move for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. She gathered her basket of roots and walked past him. As she passed, her hand brushed against his. Just a graze. A question. Draco watched her disappear into the mist. That night, he didn't sleep. He went to the family archives. He found the old wards, the ones before Lucius, before the Dark Lord. The ancient blood magic wards that protected the family not from enemies, but from sorrow. He spent the night carving runes into a small piece of silver. Protego totalum, salvia hexia. And one more, a rune he had never used before. Anima connexa, soul connection. Just before dawn, he crept to the servants' quarters where she had been moved. He didn't enter. He simply placed the silver charm under the doorframe. It wasn't an apology. It was a promise. He couldn't stop the storm, but he could be the shelter. Inside the room, Hermione woke with a start. The air, which had been damp and cold, suddenly felt warm. A soft, golden shimmer seemed to coat the walls, invisible but palpable. She sat up, clutching the thin blanket. She felt it, a pulse, a heartbeat that wasn't hers, thrumming in the stone of the room. It felt like cedar and rain. She laid back down, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel alone. She closed her eyes, and in the darkness she allowed herself to imagine his face. Not the sneering mask at the ball, but the boy in the rain, with desperation in his eyes. The armor had cracked, and through the fissure the light was pouring in. The anima connexa was not a shield. It was a noose. Draco realized this 3 nights after he had carved the rune into the threshold of the servants' quarters. He had intended it to be a silent guardian, a way to feed his own magical strength into the walls around her, so that the cold of the manor and the malice of his father could not touch her. He hadn't realized that a soul connection cuts both ways. He sat in his study in the West Wing, a glass of water trembling in his hand. It was 2 in the morning. The manor was a tomb, silent and suffocating. But inside Draco's chest, a storm was raging. He felt cold. Not the drafty chill of an old house, but a bone-deep, shivering freeze that started in his marrow and radiated outward. His teeth chattered. He wrapped his dressing gown tighter, casting a warming charm on himself, but the heat skidded off his skin like water off oil. It wasn't his cold. She is freezing. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Down in the damp, stone-walled room beneath the kitchens, Hermione was freezing. The servants' quarters were never heated properly. The house elves didn't mind the chill, but a human, a girl who had grown up in muggle houses with central heating. She must be shivering violently enough to rattle her teeth. And because he had tied his soul to hers to protect her, he was freezing too. "Damn it," Draco hissed, standing up. His legs felt heavy, sluggish. He shouldn't go to her. If Lucius found him in the servants' corridor in the middle of the night, the consequences for Hermione would be catastrophic. But the shivering in his limbs was becoming uncontrollable. His magic was fluctuating, sparking at his fingertips, reacting to her distress. He grabbed a heavy fur throw from the back of his sofa. He didn't think. He simply moved, guided by the invisible silver thread that pulled at his navel. The descent into the bowels of the manor was a journey into the dark. The portraits here were sparse, the carpets threadbare. The air grew heavier, smelling of wet stone and lye soap. When he reached her door, the rune he had carved was pulsing with a faint, distressed rhythm. Thump, 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 like a heart in panic. He didn't knock. He couldn't. His hand was shaking too badly to form a fist. He turned the handle and slipped inside. The room was tiny. A cell, really. A narrow cot, a wooden washstand, and a small, high window that let in the cruel draught of the winter night. Hermione was a lump under a thin grey blanket. She was curled into a tight ball, her entire body vibrating. She made a small whimpering sound, a sound of pure misery that tore through Draco's chest like a serrated blade. He crossed the room in 2 strides. "Hermione," he whispered. She didn't wake. She was caught in the space between sleep and hypothermia, trapped in a nightmare of ice. She turned over, her face pale in the moonlight, her lips tinged with blue. "No," she mumbled, her brow furrowed. "Please, it's too cold." Draco dropped the fur throw onto the bed, but it wasn't enough. The cold was magical now. It was the manor itself trying to reject her, trying to snuff out the foreign magic he had placed on her. The house knew she didn't belong, and it was punishing her for his protection. He sat on the edge of the narrow mattress. The springs groaned. "Granger, wake up," he commanded, his voice rough. He reached out and touched her cheek. It was like touching marble. Panic, sharp and bright, flared in his chest. I did this. In his arrogance, he had used blood magic he didn't fully understand. He had tried to be a hero and had instead become an anchor dragging her down. "Hermione!" Her eyes fluttered open. They were glassy, unfocused. She looked at him, but she didn't seem to see him. She saw a blur of silver and grey. "Draco?" she whispered, her teeth chattering so hard the word was broken. You're glowing." He looked down. His hands were faintly luminous. The bond. It was visible now, reacting to the proximity. "You're freezing," he said stupidly. I can't get warm," she stammered. A tear leaked from the corner of her eye, hot against her frozen skin. "It feels like the Dementors, inside my blood." "It's the ward," he admitted, the guilt tasting like ash. "It's drawing from you to sustain itself because the house is fighting it. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "Make it stop," she begged, reaching a trembling hand out from under the covers. She grabbed his wrist. Her grip was weak, desperate. "I can't break it," he said, his voice cracking. "Not without a ritual. Not here." "Then help me." It wasn't a demand. It was a plea for survival. Draco looked at the fur throw, then at her shivering form. He looked at the door, thinking of his father, of the rules, of the centuries of pure-blood propriety that stood between them. Then he looked at her blue lips. "Move over," he ordered. Hermione didn't argue. She didn't have the strength. She shifted slightly against the wall, making a sliver of space on the narrow cot. Draco kicked off his slippers. He didn't remove his dressing gown. He climbed into the bed, lying down beside her on top of the covers, then pulled the heavy fur throw over both of them. It was scandalous. It was forbidden. It was the most natural thing he had ever done. "Come here," he whispered. He pulled her towards him. She came willingly, desperate for heat. She buried her face in his chest, her frozen hands clutching at the silk of his lapels. Her body was a block of ice against his, but he didn't flinch. He wrapped his arms around her, engulfing her, pressing her against the length of his body. "Take it," he murmured into her hair. He closed his eyes and focused on his core, on the fire that always burned in his belly, the Malfoy magic, arrogant and eternal. He visualized it flowing out of him, through his skin, and into her. Take the heat, take everything. He felt the moment the transfer happened. A jolt like static electricity passed between them. The shivering in his own limbs stopped instantly as the circuit was completed. Hermione gasped, a sharp intake of breath against his neck. "Draco," she breathed. "Hush, just breathe." For a long time there was no sound in the room, but the wind howling outside and their synchronized breathing. Slowly, painfully, the warmth began to return. He felt her muscles unlock. He felt the blood begin to flow again in her extremities. The blue tint faded from her lips, replaced by a soft, feverish flush. She didn't pull away. She lay with her head on his shoulder, her legs tangled with his, her hand resting over his heart. She smelled of lavender soap and the damp earth of the garden, a scent that was fast becoming his favorite thing in the world. "You used blood magic," she whispered into the darkness. It wasn't a question. "I had to protect you. You tied yourself to me." She shifted, lifting her head to look at him. Her face was inches from his. In the shadows, her eyes were huge, dark pools of confusion and wonder. "Why?" "Because," Draco said, his voice low and raw. "Because if you freeze, I freeze. If you bleed, I bleed. I couldn't watch you be alone anymore. That's dangerous, Draco. If Lucius finds out, let him." Draco moved his hand, his fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of her neck. He should let go. She was warm now. He should get up, leave, and pretend this never happened. But he couldn't. The gravity was too strong. "He can't hurt you," Draco vowed, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Not anymore. I won't let him." "You're afraid of him," she whispered. She wasn't mocking him. She was stating a fact she had observed for years. "I was," he corrected. He looked at her lips, then up to her eyes. "I was afraid of everything. Of failing. Of being weak. Of being this. Human," he said bitterly. "Vulnerable." "You're not weak," Hermione said fiercely. She moved her hand up, her palm resting against his cheek. Her skin was warm now, alive. "You came for me. I always will." The air between them changed. It was no longer about survival. It was about the sudden, terrifying lack of distance. They were two enemies in a trench, huddled together against the shelling, realizing that the war was a lie. Draco leaned in. He gave her every chance to push him away. He moved slowly, his eyes searching hers for fear, for hesitation. He found none. He found only a reflection of his own desperate hunger. He brushed his lips against her forehead first, a reverence. Then he moved down. When his mouth touched hers, it wasn't an explosion. It was a sigh. It was the sound of coming home after a long, brutal journey. Her lips were soft, yielding, tasting of salt and secrets. Draco groaned low in his throat, his controls snapping. He deepened the kiss, his hand tightening in her hair, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them. The kiss was desperate, messy, filled with all the words they hadn't said in the library, all the anger of the dining room, all the longing of the years they had wasted hating each other. Hermione kissed him back with equal fervor. Her hands gripped his shoulders, pulling him down to her. She wasn't passive. She was fire. She was the chaos variable he had been looking for. For a moment, they weren't Malfoy and Granger. They weren't pure blood and mud blood. They were just two lonely souls finding the matching frequency in the dark. Draco broke the kiss, gasping for air, resting his forehead against hers. His heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, echoing the beat of the rune on the door. "You have to survive," he whispered fiercely against her mouth. "Do you hear me? You have to survive this house, because I can't do it without you." "I'm not going anywhere," she promised, her voice trembling. He kissed her again, softer this time, a lingering promise. Then he pulled back, though he didn't leave the bed. He pulled the fur throw up to her chin, tucking her in. "Sleep," he commanded softly. "I'll stay until the sun comes up. And then we figure out how to burn the cage down." Hermione closed her eyes, her hand still clutching his lapel. Within minutes, her breathing evened out. She was asleep. Draco lay awake, staring at the cracked stone ceiling. He could still taste her on his lips. The cold was gone, replaced by a terrifying, burning clarity. He was in love with her. The realization didn't bring him joy. It brought him dread, because in the world of the Malfoys, love was a weakness. Love was a leverage. If Lucius knew, He wouldn't just send her away, he would kill her. Draco tightened his arm around Hermione's sleeping form. He looked at the glowing rune on the door. Anima Connexa. He had forged a bond to save her. Now he would have to become a monster to keep her. The morning came too soon. Draco slipped out of the room before the house elves began their rounds. He left the fur throw behind, a silent sentinel against the chill. He walked back to the West Wing, his steps silent, his mind racing. He needed a plan. The defensive strategy was over. The duel in the library, the subtle protections, it wasn't enough. He needed to go on the offensive. He needed to get her out. But as he turned the corner toward his chambers, he froze. The door to his study was ajar. Draco pushed it open slowly. The room was empty, but it had been disturbed. Papers on his desk were shuffled. A drawer was slightly open. And sitting in the center of his desk, impaled by a silver letter opener, was a piece of parchment. It was the arithmancy chart Hermione had been working on in the library weeks ago. The one where she had calculated the variable of chaos. But someone had written over it in red ink. The variable has been isolated. Draco stared at the note, the blood draining from his face. It wasn't Lucius's handwriting. It was sharper, more jagged. Bellatrix? No, she was dead. He picked up the parchment. It smelled of heavy, cloying perfume. Pansy. Pansy Parkinson had been in the house. She had been at the Yule Ball. She had seen the way he looked at Hermione. And unlike Lucius, who was blinded by arrogance, Pansy was driven by jealousy. She knew. And if Pansy knew, the entire Sacred 28 would know by noon. Draco crushed the parchment in his fist. The sanctuary of the night was gone. The secret was out. He looked toward the window, where the sun was struggling to rise over the grey grounds of the manor. "War it is, then," he whispered. He turned and headed straight for the family armory. He wasn't going to get a stronger shield. He was going to get a sword. Hermione woke not to the bite of the cold, but to a searing phantom pain in her left hand. She gasped, sitting bolt upright on the narrow cot, clutching her wrist. The skin was unblemished, pale and smooth in the grey morning light, but the sensation was undeniable. A throbbing, stinging burn, as if she had grabbed a red-hot iron. It wasn't her pain. The realization settled over her like a heavy cloak. The anima connexa, the soul bond Draco had carved into the threshold. It was open. It was live. And somewhere in the sprawling labyrinthine belly of Malfoy Manor, Draco was hurting. She threw off the heavy fur throw, his throw smelling of cedar and safety, and scrambled to her feet. The door to the servants' quarters was unlocked, but the air in the corridor felt thick, viscous like treacle. The manor itself was reacting, its ancient magic roiling in agitation. "Miss Granger!" Hermione spun around. Narcissa Malfoy stood at the end of the hallway. She wore robes of severe mourning black, her blonde hair pulled back so tightly it pulled at the skin of her temples. Her face was a mask of marble, beautiful and terrifyingly blank. "Narcissa," Hermione breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Draco. I can feel him. Something is wrong." "Come with me," Narcissa said. Her voice was devoid of its usual velvet condescension. It was flat, brittle. "Do not speak. Do not run. Walk." Hermione hesitated, looking at the older woman's eyes. There was no warmth there, but there was no malice either. There was fear. A controlled, high-stakes fear that mirrored Hermione's own. She followed. They ascended the service stairs, winding up through the skeleton of the house. The pain in Hermione's hand flared again, then shifted to a dull ache in her chest. He's afraid, she realized with a jolt. He's not just in pain, he's terrified. "Where are we going?" Hermione whispered, unable to keep silent. "The drawing room," Narcissa replied without breaking stride. "Lucius has convened a council." "A council? For what?" Narcissa stopped abruptly. She turned, her ice-blue eyes boring into Hermione's. "For you, you foolish girl. For the theft of the Malfoy magic." She glanced at Hermione's chest, where the invisible bond thrummed. "Did you think Lucius wouldn't sense it? Did you think you could bind your soul to the air and go unnoticed?" Hermione's blood ran cold. "I didn't ask for it." "No." Narcissa softened. "Just a fraction. A crack in the porcelain." "No, you wouldn't have. Draco has always been dramatic." She reached out, her cool fingers brushing a stray curl from Hermione's forehead. "He is like his aunt in that way. He loves too loudly. It will get him killed." She turned back around. "Fix your face, Hermione. If you look weak, Lucius will tear you apart before Draco can even draw his wand." The drawing room was a cavern of shadows. The heavy drapes were drawn, blocking out the weak winter sun. The only light came from the fireplace, where green flames roared unnaturally high, casting long skeletal shadows against the walls. Lucius stood by the mantel, his silhouette sharp and menacing. Pansy Parkinson sat on the velvet sofa, looking pale and triumphant, twisting a lace handkerchief in her hands. Beside her sat a man Hermione didn't recognize, a heavy-set wizard in ministry robes with the insignia of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. And there, in the center of the room, on his knees, was Draco. Hermione let out a strangled sound. Draco's shirt was torn at the shoulder. There was no blood, but he was breathing hard, sweat plastering his hair to his forehead. His hands were bound behind his back with shimmering magical cords. At the sound of her gasp, his head snapped up. His eyes found hers instantly. "Run," the look said. "Get out." But the bond sang a different song. "Stay. I need you." "Ah," Lucius purred, turning slowly. "The thief returns to the scene of the crime." "I stole nothing," Hermione said, her voice trembling but clear. She stepped into the room, moving away from Narcissa's shadow. She channeled every ounce of the arrogance she had learned from watching the Malfoys for 10 years. "I am a ward of this house, Lucius. I have only ever accepted what was given." "Given?" Lucius laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He walked toward Draco, circling him like a shark. "My son gave you a fur throw. He gave you his time. He gave you his attention." He stopped, leaning down to hiss in Draco's ear. "And then he gave you this." Lucius raised his cane and struck Draco across the face. The crack echoed like a gunshot. Hermione screamed, her hand flying to her own cheek as a sympathetic flare of pain exploded across her face. She stumbled back, tears springing to her eyes. Draco didn't make a sound. He spat blood onto the expensive Persian rug and looked up at his father with a sneer that was all Malfoy. "Is that all you have, father?" Draco rasped. "I've had worse from a bludger." "You bound yourself to her," Lucius roared, losing his composure. The veneer of the aristocrat shattered, revealing the desperate, bigoted man beneath. "You used the anima connexa, ancient sacred blood magic, on a mudblood." "She is worth 10 of you," Draco spat. Lucius raised the cane again, the silver snakehead glinting with dark magic. "No!" Hermione lunged forward. She didn't think. She didn't reach for a wand she didn't have. She just threw herself between the cane and Draco. The blow never landed. Just as the silver snake was about to strike her shoulder, a shockwave of pure white force erupted from Draco. The magical cords binding his wrists disintegrated into smoke. He surged upward, catching the cane in mid-air with his bare hand. The room froze. Draco stood tall, his hand wrapped around the shaft of the cane, inches from his father's face. His grey eyes were glowing with a terrifying, luminous light, the same light Hermione had seen in the servants' quarters. "Don't," Draco whispered. The word was heavy, vibrating with power. "Touch her." Lucius stared at his son, shock warring with fury. He tried to pull the cane back, but Draco held it fast. "You dare raise a hand to the Lord of the Manor?" Lucius hissed. "I am the heir," Draco said, his voice dropping an octave, resonating with the stone of the floor, the walls, the very foundation of the house. "And by the laws of the Anima Connexa, an attack on my bonded is an attack on me. You have forfeited your right to command me." He ripped the cane from his father's grip and snapped it over his knee. The sound of the wood breaking was the sound of a dynasty ending. Lucius stumbled back, clutching his chest as if he'd been struck. The ministry officials stood up, looking alarmed. Pansy let out a small shriek. "Arrest him!" Lucius screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Draco. "He is unstable. He is using dark artifacts. He has been corrupted by the girl." The official reached for his wand. "I wouldn't," Hermione said. The room turned to her. She was standing next to Draco now. She wasn't trembling anymore. The fear had evaporated, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. She felt the bond humming between them, a live wire of shared strength. She felt Draco's magic pouring into her, and hers pouring into him. They were a circuit, a closed loop of power. "Draco isn't using a dark artifact," Hermione said, her voice steady. "He's using the manor's own defense mechanisms. The Anima Connexa isn't dark magic, Lucius. It's protective magic. It was designed to keep the family safe." She looked at Draco. He was looking at her, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and adoration. "And right now," she continued, "the manor has decided who the family is." The fire in the grate flared green, then turned a blinding, brilliant gold. The shadows in the corners of the room receded. The portraits on the walls, ancestors who had sneered at her for a decade, suddenly fell silent, bowing their heads in their frames. Draco reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlaced with hers. The sensation was electric. It was like plugging into a lightning storm. "Get out," Draco said to the room at large. "This is my house," Lucius shrieked, reaching for his wand. "Cruci." Draco moved faster than thought. He didn't use a spell. He didn't use a wand. He squeezed Hermione's hand, pulling on her magic, her stability, her sheer force of will. He thrust his other hand forward. A blast of wind, concentrated and violent, swept through the room. It lifted Lucius, the ministry official, and Pansy off their feet and slammed them against the far wall. They slid to the floor, dazed. Narcissa remained standing by the door, untouched. She watched them, her face unreadable. Draco didn't wait. He grabbed Hermione's waist, pulling her close. "We have to go," he murmured into her ear. "The wards are confused. They're loyal to me for now, but Lucius knows the override codes. We have 5 minutes before this place becomes a fortress against us." Where? Hermione asked, breathless. Anywhere but here. He dragged her toward the French doors that led to the garden. He kicked them open, shattering the glass. The cold winter air rushed in, but Hermione didn't feel it. She was burning with the heat of the bond. They ran. They ran through the snow-covered rose garden, past the frozen fountains, past the spot where she had dug for mandrakes in the mud. They didn't stop until they reached the heavy iron gates of the estate. Draco slammed his hand against the metal. Open! The gates groaned, resisting. The ancient iron twisted, fighting his command. Lucius was already countering him from inside the house. Draco! Hermione gasped, looking back. Lights were flaring in the windows of the manor. Spells were beginning to rain down from the upper terraces, jets of red and green light exploding in the snow around them. It won't open! Draco snarled, panic edging into his voice. He battered the gate with his magic, but it held fast. He's locked the perimeter. They were trapped. Hermione looked at the high stone walls. Then she looked at Draco. He was pale, frantic, his eyes darting around for a solution. He looked like the boy she had known in school, scared and cornered. But he wasn't that boy anymore, and she wasn't that girl. Draco, she said, grabbing his face with both hands. Look at me. He focused on her, his pupils blown wide. I'm sorry. I trapped us. The equation, she said urgently. What? The arithmancy equation, the variable of chaos. You said I failed because I didn't account for the partner. Draco blinked, the gears in his mind turning. Yes. We are the partners now, she said. We don't need to break the gate, Draco. We need to become the gate. We need to overload the wardstone. That could kill us. The feedback. If we do it alone, yes. But together. She pressed her forehead against his. Trust me. Draco hesitated for only a fraction of a second. Then he nodded. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her body flush against his. He buried his face in her neck. Do it. Hermione closed her eyes. She reached deep inside herself, past the fear, past the years of servitude, finding the core of her magic, the bright, logical, fierce Gryffindor fire. She pushed it toward the bond. At the same time, she felt Draco do the same. His magic was cool, sharp, slippery like mercury. The two forces met in the space between their souls. They didn't clash. They fused. Gold and silver, fire and ice. Hermione raised her hand toward the gate. Draco placed his hand over hers. Bombarda Maxima, they whispered in unison. It wasn't a spell. It was a supernova. A beam of blinding iridescent light erupted from their joined hands. It hit the iron gates, not with a bang, but with a sound like a choir screaming. The metal didn't just break, it vaporized. The stone pillars crumbled into dust. The shock wave knocked them both backward into the snow. Silence returned to the grounds. Hermione lay on her back, staring up at the grey sky. Snowflakes drifted down, landing on her hot cheeks. She felt drained, hollowed out, but alive. A shadow fell over her. Draco was leaning over her. His face was streaked with soot, his lip was bleeding, and his hair was a mess. He was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. You, he panted, a lopsided, incredulous smile tugging at his mouth, are a terrifying witch, Granger. You're not so bad yourself, Malfoy, she whispered. He reached down and pulled her up. He didn't let go of her hand. He looked back at the manor, the looming dark silhouette that had been his home, his prison, and her cage. Smoke was rising from the ruined gates. The alarms were wailing now, a distant, mournful sound. "We can never come back," he said softly. "Good," Hermione said. Draco looked at her, his expression sobering. He squeezed her hand, the bond pulsing gently between them, no longer a frantic warning, but a steady, rhythmic reassurance. "I have a safe house," he said, "in France. It's unplottable. Mother set it up years ago, for a rainy day." "It's raining," Hermione noted, tilting her head to the sky. Draco laughed, a real free sound that carried on the wind. "Come on." He turned on the spot. This time there was no anti-apparition jinx to stop them. The manor, defeated by its own magic, let them go. With a loud crack, the snowy drive was empty. Only the broken cane and the melted iron remained as proof that the porcelain ward had not just broken, she had exploded. France, 3 days later. The safe house was a small cottage on the coast of Brittany, hidden behind dunes of swaying grass and wild thistles. It smelled of salt and dried herbs, not silver polish and oppression. Hermione stood on the porch, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, watching the ocean churn. Her hands still throbbed occasionally, phantom echoes of Draco's mood. But mostly, the bond was a quiet hum in the back of her mind, a tether. She heard the door open behind her. Draco stepped out. He was wearing muggle clothes, jeans and a thick grey sweater he'd found in a trunk. He looked younger, softer. The sharp edges of the Malfoy air were blunted by the sea air. He came to stand beside her, leaning his elbows on the railing. He didn't touch her, but the air between them was charged, magnetic. "Lucius has put a bounty on us," he said quietly. "The Daily Prophet is calling it a kidnapping. Apparently, I have bewitched you." Hermione snorted. "Bewitched me? I blew up his gate." "Details." Draco smirked, looking out at the horizon. "He's disowned me, burned me off the tapestry. I felt it happen this morning, a sharp pinch like a bug bite. I'm sorry, Draco." "Don't be." He turned to face her. The grey eyes were clear, free of the shadows that had haunted them for weeks. "I've never felt lighter." He reached out and took her hand, the one that had felt his pain. He traced the lines of her palm with his thumb. "I have nothing to offer you now, Granger," he said, his voice serious. "No title, no fortune, just this." He gestured vaguely at himself. A fugitive with a temper and a complex. Hermione looked at him. She saw the uncertainty in his eyes, the fear that now that the adrenaline was gone, she would realize she had made a mistake. She stepped closer, closing the gap. She let the blanket fall from her shoulders. "I don't want a title," she whispered. "I want the partner." Draco let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since he was 11 years old. He cupped her face, his hands warm and rough. "You have him," he vowed. "Always." He kissed her then, not with the desperation of the servants' quarters, but with a slow, deliberate tenderness. It was a kiss of promise, a kiss of beginning. The sea roared below them, wild and untamable. But for the first time in her life, Hermione didn't need to control it. She just let it crash. She was safe. She was free. And she was loved. The cottage in Brittany was named L'Écume, the sea foam. It was a fitting name for a place that felt like it existed on the edge of the world, suspended between the grey fury of the Atlantic and the wild, wind-swept dunes of the French coast. It had been a week since their escape. 7 days of silence, salt, and a sky that seemed too big after the suffocating ceilings of Malfoy Manor. Hermione sat on the rugged rug before the hearth, a mug of tea warming her hands. The fire was real, fed by driftwood Draco had collected from the beach, burning with violet and blue hues from the sea salt. She watched the flames dance, her mind drifting. The transition from prisoner to fugitive had been jarring, but the shift from enemies to this was a vertigo she hadn't quite mastered. Draco was in the kitchen. She could hear the clatter of pans, the hiss of water boiling, the low mutter of curses as he navigated a space without house elves. He was trying to cook. It was a disaster, and it was the most endearing thing she had ever seen. He walked into the living room a moment later, wiping his hands on a rag. He wore a thick fisherman's jumper he had found in a trunk, the wool rough and dark against his pale throat. His hair, usually so severe, was wind-blown and soft, falling into his eyes. He looked stripped down, raw. "The stew is edible," he announced, eyeing the fire. "I think, though I may have accidentally transfigured the carrots into something rubbery." Hermione smiled, a genuine, easy expression that felt new on her face. "I like rubbery carrots." Draco didn't smile back. He stood by the window, looking out at the darkening sea. The storm shutters were rattling. A gale was blowing in, whipping the waves into a frenzy that mirrored the chaos they had left behind. "I felt it again," he said quietly, his back to her. "The bond, it spiked." Hermione set her mug down. She touched her chest where the anima connexa usually hummed like a second heartbeat. Right now, it was quiet for her. "I didn't feel pain." "No, not pain." He turned, his silhouette framed by the grey twilight. "Regret. It tasted like ash." He walked over to the armchair opposite her and sank into it, looking exhausted. Not physically. He was stronger than she had ever seen him, but spiritually. The weight of disownment, of severing a 1,000-year-old lineage, was settling in. "Do you regret it?" Hermione asked softly. "No." The answer was instant. "I regret that I didn't burn it down sooner." He looked at his hands, the hands that had held a cane, a wand, and now a wooden spoon. "But I regret what I did to you, Granger. I tied you to a ghost. I have no name, no vault, no influence. You are the brightest witch of your age, and you are stuck in a shack with a man who can't even boil potatoes without magical assistance." "Draco." "And the bond," he interrupted, his voice bitter. "I forced it on you. You didn't choose it. You didn't choose me. You just survived me." The self-loathing was thick, a defensive wall he was rebuilding brick by brick because he didn't know how to be safe without one. He was terrified that now, in the quiet, she would realize he wasn't a savior, but a burden. Hermione stood up. The movement was fluid, decisive. She crossed the small space between them and knelt before his chair, placing her hands on his knees. He flinched, then stilled, looking down at her with wide, unguarded eyes. "Listen to me," she said, her voice steady. "I spent 10 years in your house, learning to read silence. I know the difference between a trap and a choice." She took one of his hands, uncurling the fingers that were clenched tight. She pressed his palm against her cheek, closing her eyes. "Feel it," she whispered. "Don't look at the bond. Look at me." Draco hesitated. Then, slowly, his thumb brushed her cheekbone. He took a shuddering breath. "I feel warmth," he murmured. "Calm." "That's not the bond, Draco. That's me." She opened her eyes, locking her gaze with his. The bond connects us, yes. It kept us alive. But it didn't make me pull you out of the wreckage of that gate. It didn't make me come here. Then why? He whispered, his voice cracking. Why are you here? Because you are the only person who ever saw the war in me, she confessed, the truth tumbling out. Everyone else saw the books, the grades, the perfect victim. You saw the anger. You saw the pride. You challenged me to be dangerous. She leaned in, resting her chin on his knee. I don't want a hero, Draco. I don't want a pure-blood prince with a vault full of gold. I want the partner who stood in the library and told me to rewrite the equation. Draco stared at her, his grey eyes searching her face for any sign of deception. Slowly, the tension left his shoulders. The bitterness in his expression dissolved, replaced by a profound, quiet wonder. Dangerous, he repeated softly, a small, crooked smile touching his lips. Is that what we are? I think we might be. He reached down, gripping her arms, and pulled her up. He didn't let go. He pulled her into his lap, settling her against his chest, as if it were the only place she belonged. The chair was large, worn velvet, and they fit together in the tangle of limbs and wool. It was intimate in a way the bedroom in the servants' quarters hadn't been. That had been desperation. This was domesticity. This was claiming. Draco buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling deeply. You smell like the sea now. The lavender is gone. Is that a complaint? No. He kissed the sensitive skin below her ear, sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. It's an improvement. Lavender is for porcelain dolls. Salt is for survivors. Hermione turned in his arms so she could face him. The firelight cast shadows across his sharp features, softening the angles. He looked younger than his 20 years, yet ancient in his eyes. What do we do now? She asked, her hand tracing the line of his jaw, feeling the roughness of stubble. We live, Draco said simply. We stay here. The wards I set are blood-based. Lucius can't track them because he disowned me. The irony is delicious, really. His own bigotry is our shield. And after? After. He paused, catching her hand and kissing her palm. We go where we want. America, Australia, or we stay here and become fishermen. I hear the market for magical seafood is untapped. Hermione laughed, a bright sound that seemed to banish the last of the ghosts in the room. You, a fisherman? You'd hex the nets. I'm a fast learner. He grew serious then, his gaze dropping to her lips. The playful banter faded, replaced by a heavy, charged silence. The air between them thickened, vibrating with the static of the bond and the undeniable pull of their own bodies. Hermione, he whispered. It was the first time he had used her name without fear or desperation. It sounded like a prayer. Draco. He leaned in slowly, giving her every second to pull away. But she didn't want to pull away. She wanted to close the distance. She wanted to erase the years of mud-blood and ferret, the years of opposite sides, the years of wasted time. She met him halfway. The kiss was slow, deliberate, and devastatingly tender. It wasn't the frantic clash of teeth they had shared in the manor. It was a conversation. It was soft, like the brush of velvet, tasting of tea and rain. Draco's hand came up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her curls, holding her to him as if she were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. Hermione sighed into the kiss, her body melting against his. She felt the bond hum in her chest, a warm, golden resonance that sang of contentment. It wasn't a chain anymore. It was a melody. He deepened the kiss, just slightly, testing the waters. A flicker of heat, a hint of the passion he kept leashed beneath the surface. Hermione responded, her hands gripping the wool of his sweater, pulling him closer. She felt his heart racing against her chest, a frantic rhythm that betrayed his calm facade. He broke the kiss, but didn't pull back. He rested his forehead against hers, their breathing mingling. "I love you," he whispered. The words hung in the air, fragile and absolute. Hermione's breath hitched. She opened her eyes. Draco was watching her, terrified and brave. "I know," she whispered back. I think I've loved you since you blew up the library." Draco let out a laugh, a breathy, incredulous sound. "That was vandalism, Granger, not romance. With you, the line is blurry." He smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. It was a smile she had never seen before, free, open, and utterly hers. "Stay with me," he said. "Tonight, tomorrow, always." "Always," she promised. Draco shifted, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders, tucking her in closer. He looked out the window at the storm raging over the Atlantic. The waves were crashing against the cliffs, violent and relentless, but inside the cottage the fire was warm and the walls held fast. They sat there for a long time, watching the night roll in. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of understanding, of shared history, of a future that was unwritten and terrifying and beautiful. Hermione rested her head on his shoulder, listening to the steady beat of his heart. She thought of the porcelain doll Narcissa had tried to make her. That doll was broken, shattered on the floor of the manor. But the woman who remained was made of stronger stuff. She was made of magic, of salt, and of the fierce, enduring love of the boy who held her. Outside, the wind howled, trying to find a way in. But it didn't matter. The storm could rage all it wanted. They were the eye of the hurricane, and they were finally, truly home.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for listening. Writing this story was emotional for me. I wanted to show that love is not always soft. Sometimes love is sharp. It is dangerous. Draco and Hermione start as enemy here. They use silence like a weapon. But deep down, they are just two lonely people. They are trapped in a cold house. And they are the only fire that burns. My favorite part in this change, he tries to break her like a doll, but instead she makes him human. I hope you felt the tension. I hope you felt the cold turn into warmth. Thank you for being part of this journey with me. See you in the next story.